On Nighttime Scribe, we dive into the shadows of the past to uncover truths that will make you rethink everything. Today, get ready to face an uncomfortable reality. Some of the greatest ancient Greek philosophers were, by today's standards, honestly pretty repulsive. Yes, you heard that right. Forget the idealized image of perfectly clean sages. We're talking about guys like Diogenes of Sinope, who lived in a barrel, did disgusting things in public, and ate whatever he could find in the trash. Or other thinkers who rejected social norms, personal hygiene, and even the simplest modesty. Think it's just eccentricity? Not even close. This is where Nighttime Scribe breaks down that simple-minded view. Behind what we now see as filthy or weird, there was a deep, radical philosophy at play. These behaviors weren't signs of ignorance or lack of means. They were the rawest, most honest expression of their principles. They were a slap in the face to hypocrisy, a harsh pursuit of truth and virtue that meant giving up all unnecessary things, even cleanliness or proper manners. We're about to walk through history to see how the pre-Socratics, the giants of the classical era, and the Hellenistic schools pushed their ideas to the extreme, shaping not only their minds, but also their bodies and daily lives in ways that seem shocking today. Brace yourself for a tough but eye-opening journey, because once you understand why these philosophers lived the way they did, Greek philosophy will never look the same. And maybe, just maybe, you'll start seeing dirt in a whole new way. Before you settle in, take a moment to give this video a like and subscribe. Also drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see who's joining us from all over the world. I'm Nighttime Scribe, and my goal is to take you on a unique experience as you drift off to sleep. To understand why some Greek philosophers seemed repulsive or strange, we first have to dive into the heart of their world, the polis. The Greek city-state wasn't just a place on a map, it was the center of life, identity, and thought. In it, being a citizen was key. It wasn't just about where you were born, it meant actively taking part in public life, the assembly, courts, war, and yes, philosophical debates in the agora. Public life was where the Greek character was shaped. There wasn't a sharp divide between public and private life like we think of today. The home mattered, sure, but true personal growth, the fullness of one's life, came from constant interaction with other citizens. Reputation was gold, speaking well was essential, and following social rules was almost sacred. Breaking those rules wasn't just being quirky, it could be seen as threatening the community's unity. In this strict setup, where areté, virtue, meant excelling at your civic duties, the philosopher often stood out. They weren't priests, rulers, or professional speakers. They were truth seekers, but their ways and ideas often clashed with traditions. Picture Socrates, a man who taught for free, questioned the powerful openly, went barefoot and wore simple clothes, in a society where fine clothes, owning slaves, and joining civic rituals showed status and fit in. Socrates was, to say the least, a puzzle. His dirtiness, or his detachment from material things, was on purpose. It was a statement that true wealth and virtue came from knowing yourself and chasing truth, not from appearances or possessions. This detachment was itself a radical act. Think about it. While most people tried to succeed within the polis system, real philosophers often acted like a thorn in its side, a voice out of tune. Philosophy wasn't a hobby, it was a way of life that might call for rejecting comforts and social rules if they got in the way of truth. It wasn't about being careless just for the sake of it, but about a value system where cleansing the soul and clear thinking mattered way more than bodily cleanliness or popular approval. For them, the body was often seen as a prison or barrier to the mind. This disdain for the everyday and for appearances was a critique of society's shallowness. If a philosopher like Diogenes lived in extreme poverty and acted shockingly, it wasn't ignorance or madness. It was a philosophical act. a living story exposing the hypocrisy and emptiness of common goals. Filth was basically a dirty mirror, showing what he saw as the moral cleanliness of a corrupt or hollow society. It was a constant provocation, inviting people to look beyond conventions and question what really matters. In ancient Greece, paideia, education, wasn't just about knowledge, but about shaping someone into an ideal citizen. A well-educated man was expected to be cultured, eloquent, physically fit, and deeply aware of his civic and moral duties. Paideia sought balance between body and mind. Gymnastics for strength, music and poetry to refine the spirit, and rhetoric for skill in public debate. Speaking well was especially important. A well-educated man had to persuade, argue, and defend his views in assemblies or courts. Eloquence wasn't just a skill, it showed clear thinking and the power to influence the polis. Appearance, manners, and respect for customs were part of this training. A messy or rude person was suspicious because it suggested lack of self-control and disregard for community values. This is where the tension with philosophers comes in. Traditional paideia prepared citizens to succeed inside the system. Many philosophers, especially the radicals, questioned exactly that. The educated man aimed to fit in. The philosopher often refused. Take Diogenes the Cynic as the clearest example. Paideia valued modesty and wealth, but not extreme poverty. It respected eloquence, but not shocking speech. In contrast, Diogenes embraced voluntary, extreme poverty, living on the streets, begging for food, and doing things in public that we'd today consider obscene or taboo. He wasn't interested in persuading people with fancy arguments. Instead, he chose to confront them through direct action and mockery. For him, real education didn't come from books or teachers of rhetoric, but from rejecting the conventions and superficiality he saw in educated society. His filth was a statement. True virtue wasn't about appearances, but about authenticity and radical self-reliance. While paideia aimed to shape a well-rounded, virtuous citizen for the community, a radical philosopher like Diogenes sought a virtue beyond social norms, even if it meant being an outcast. His method wasn't formal teaching, but provocation. His life was his philosophy, raw and unfiltered, a mirror held up to Greek society that made them uncomfortable, forcing them to question their own values of decency, property, and manners. By rejecting the norms of paideia, the philosopher became a subversive force, a constant reminder that true wisdom could come from the least expected places, even filth. In ancient Greece, ideas of wisdom, sophia, and virtue, areté, were central to many debates, but what they meant depended on who you asked. Not all knowledge seekers were the same. There were big differences between sophists, intellectuals, and philosophers. These distinctions help explain why philosophers could seem so strange. Sophists were basically traveling experts in rhetoric and persuasion. They cared less about absolute truth and more about winning arguments. They charged high fees to teach young men how to speak well, win debates, and defend any position, no matter its moral standing. For sophists, areté showed up as the ability to succeed in public life, to master speech, to gain influence, and climb the social ladder. They were pragmatic, often relativistic, using wisdom as a tool for power. If a sophist looked clean and respectable, it was because his success depended on that image. The intellectual, broadly speaking, was anyone devoted to study and learning across fields, from history to math. They earned respect for their knowledge and mental sharpness. Their sophia was about accumulating facts and understanding the world. But intellectuals didn't necessarily challenge society's structure or live very differently. Their pursuit of virtue often matched the traditional values of paideia and civic excellence. Then there was the philosopher. For thinkers like Socrates and his followers, sophia wasn't just information or rhetorical skill. it was a deep knowledge of truth and goodness, knowing how one should live. This wisdom was tied to areté, which meant moral excellence of the soul. It wasn't about how you spoke, but how you acted, not about looking good, but being good. This is the key point and why some philosophers seemed so strange. For the true philosopher, pursuing wisdom and virtue often meant purifying the soul, detaching from worldly pleasures, fame, money, and appearances. If society prized wealth, the philosopher might embrace poverty. If comfort was valued, the philosopher might choose austerity. If decorum and hygiene were prized, the radical philosopher might reject them if he saw them as distractions or masks hiding the spirit's real corruption. Diogenes of Sinope is the strongest example of this. He saw sophists as empty showmen and intellectuals as complacent with a corrupt system. His dirtiness and shocking lifestyle weren't accidents. They were the result of his cynic philosophy, which called for living naturally, rejecting social conventions, possessions, and fake virtues. For Diogenes, true areté was autarkeia, self-sufficiency and total freedom from social chains, even if that meant appearing a dirty vagabond to others. His repulsiveness was his way of calling out the moral corruption he saw in society's hypocrisy. So, while sophists and intellectuals sought wisdom and virtue within society's accepted rules, the philosopher, especially the radicals, often had to go beyond or even challenge those rules, turning their lives into a living demonstration of their deepest beliefs, no matter how shocking. To understand why some philosophers seemed repugnant, it's important to know what was considered clean and normal in ancient Greece. We tend to project our modern hygiene standards onto the past, which distorts the picture. The truth is, the Greeks didn't have our level of hygiene, but they weren't generally filthy. Their habits were different, suited to their technology and views on the body, public baths and exercise. The Greeks loved physical exercise, and places like palestras and gymnasia were central social hubs. After workouts, people often scraped their skin with a strigil, a curved metal tool to remove sweat, oil, and dirt, then rinsed with mostly cold water. There were public baths, but not like ours. They were more like rinsing stations or steam rooms. Soap, as we know it, wasn't used. Instead, perfumed oils were common. Taking a full bath daily was a luxury or a ceremonial thing, not an everyday routine. Clothing and appearances. Greek clothing like the chiton and himation was simple, usually linen or wool, washed with natural bleach. Ordinary folks wore practical, basic clothes. Clean clothes were valued, but expectations weren't like ours. Wearing patched fabric or having some dust from the road was normal for anyone outside the elite. Decorum meant clothes shouldn't be flashy, but appropriate for the season and activity. Sandals or going barefoot was common, especially for lower classes or in rural areas. Diet and eating habits. The Greek diet was Mediterranean. Grains, olives, wine, fish, and some vegetables. Meat was less common. They ate with their hands or simple spoons, and modern ideas about food safety didn't exist. Food handling was more direct and less regulated than today, breaking the myth that everyone was generally filthy. So why did some philosophers seem especially dirty? The key is that while the average Greek kept a functional, socially acceptable level of hygiene for their time, some philosophers deliberately rejected even those basic standards. It wasn't that Greek society as a whole was filthy, but that certain philosophers chose to be, to a degree that shocked even their peers. While a typical citizen might scrape themselves after exercise and wear clean clothes, Diogenes gave up those practices entirely. He didn't shave, wore rags, lived in a barrel on the street, and openly did bodily functions in public. His filth wasn't because he lacked access to hygiene, but a radical philosophical choice. It was a deliberate provocation, a way to show that true freedom and virtue came from total indifference to social conventions, modesty and material comforts, including cleanliness. So the repulsiveness of these philosophers wasn't a sign of a dirty society, but an intentional exaggeration of behavior that broke even minimal standards of decency. It was their way of living philosophy, taking their principles to the extreme, however uncomfortable. In ancient Greece, the line between genius, eccentricity, and madness wasn't as clear as it is today. What we might label mental illness, they often saw through cultural or spiritual lenses. The boundaries were blurry, which adds complexity to how some of the strangest philosophers were viewed. To the Greeks, unusual behavior wasn't always mental illness. Sometimes it was seen as a kind of divine inspiration, a connection to the gods. This idea of divine mania, mania theia, is explored by Plato in his dialogue Phaedrus. Instead of being negative, mania could be a blessing, a form of blessed madness showing up in prophecy, poetry, love, or, importantly, philosophical insight. Think of the oracles at Delphi, whose priestesses went into trances to deliver prophecies. Their behavior was unusual but revered as a voice of the gods. Similarly, a poet inspired by the muses or a lover overtaken by eros was seen as possessed by a divine force. Socratic madness. Take Socrates. His daemonion, his inner divine voice, guided him, but his endless questioning, refusal to accept common wisdom, and disregard for status or possessions struck many as extreme eccentricity. Critics called him a corrupter of youth, a fraud, or even mad. Yet his followers saw that same madness as a mark of genius, his full dedication to seeking truth and virtue. Socratic madness was a philosophical mania, an unstoppable urge to question and examine life. The Greeks recognized real mental illness too, explained in various ways from imbalanced humors to divine punishment. The big difference was intention. Divine mania had a higher purpose, a message or truth to reveal. A philosopher's odd behavior, though outside the norm, was based on a clear system of thought and a deliberate, radical way of living. So when Diogenes lived in a barrel, defecated in public, or gave cheeky winks in the marketplace, actions most saw as shameless, it was an extreme expression of his cynic philosophy. Yes, it was madness, but madness ruled by reason and a firm belief that a truly virtuous life meant rejecting social rules, modesty, and hypocrisy. His madness was the purest form of his philosophical genius, pushing the idea of living naturally to the absolute limit, no matter what society thought. The line between genius and madness blurred when philosophy became such a radical way of life that it challenged society's idea of sanity. To really understand why Greek philosophers, especially the weirdest ones, behaved as they did, you have to see them in the context of the religion and mythology that touched every part of Greek life. Unlike modern religions with clear dogmas and texts, Greek religion was a complex mix of Olympian gods, local myths, civic rituals, and personal beliefs. There was no sharp divide between the secular and sacred. The city-state itself was deeply tied to its patron gods and rituals. Oracles, especially Delphi, were hugely important. People believed the gods spoke through oracles. An oracle's words could influence politics, war, and personal choices. Consulting the Pythia, Apollo's priestess at Delphi, was a sacred act, often with vague or puzzling answers. Even philosophers, despite their focus on reason, were influenced by this. The famous declaration by the Delphic oracle that Socrates was the wisest man in Athens sparked his lifelong quest for truth, leading him to question citizens and expose ignorance. This divine mission made him controversial, but his devotion, interpreted through reason, reflected the deep spirituality of the time. Besides public cults, there were mystery cults like those at Eleusis or Lysios. These secret groups promised deeper religious experiences and hope for life after death. Their rites were secretive and mystical, aiming for personal connection with the divine. Philosophers like Pythagoras and his followers, who believed in soul transmigration and practiced strict dietary and purity rules, clearly showed influence from these mystical traditions. Their odd behaviors, like avoiding meat or living communally under strict rules, reflected their quest for spiritual purification. Popular beliefs also mattered. People believed in nymphs, satyrs, heroes, and local spirits. Omens, dreams, and interpreting nature were everyday parts of life. Philosophers, by questioning myth-based explanations in search of rational causes, often clashed with traditional views. Take Anaxagoras, for example. He was accused of impiety for saying the sun was a glowing stone, not a god. But for many philosophers, criticizing popular beliefs or empty rituals didn't mean denying the divine. Instead, they were searching for a purer, less irrational understanding of God or the gods. They saw morality and virtue not just as civic duties, but as alignment with a cosmic order or a higher divine law. The filth or odd behavior of philosophers like Diogenes was also a way to call out religious hypocrisy and meaningless rituals. For him, true piety wasn't about sacrifices or formal prayers, but living an authentic, virtuous life in harmony with nature, rejecting the human customs he saw as corrupt. His disdain for social norms was itself a kind of cynical piety, aiming for a direct connection with a natural way of life. He considered more divine than temples and rites made by people. So the relationship between philosophers and religion was complex. Some sought a deeper understanding of the divine. Others criticized popular religion, but almost all worked within a culture where the sacred and mythical were powerful forces inspiring or challenging their radical search for truth. Before Socrates changed the game in Athens, there was a line of thinkers, often mysterious, who laid the groundwork for Western philosophy. The pre-Socratics mainly lived in Greek colonies like Ionia, Asia Minor, and southern Italy between the 6th and 5th centuries BC. They weren't dirty like Diogenes, but their radicalism was different. They broke boldly with the old mythical way of explaining the world. Before them, natural forces, celestial events, and life's origins were explained through myths and stories about the whims and dramas of the Olympic gods. The epics of Homer and Hesiod were the encyclopedia and cosmology of their time. Rain meant Zeus's will. Earthquakes were Poseidon's anger. There was no place for rational inquiry until the pre-Socratics arrived. They dared to ask a radical, simple question. What is the fundamental substance everything is made of? This search for the areté, the principle or basic element of reality, marked the birth of philosophy and science as we know it. Divine explanations weren't enough anymore. They wanted a natural, logical, universal cause. So Thales of Miletus said everything was water because life depends on it. His student Anaximander went further, proposing the apeiron, the boundless or indefinite, as the areté, a fundamental element beyond what we can see. Anaximenes suggested air was the key, believing that processes like condensation and rarefaction explained the world's variety. What made them radical wasn't their hygiene, but their intellectual bravery. They trusted reason and observation over tradition, authority, and myth. They didn't just scratch the surface. They tried to uncover the cosmos's deep structure, convinced the human mind could discover an underlying order. This boldness paved the way for all later philosophy and science, laying the foundation for thinkers after Socrates to push radical ideas not just about the world, but about how to live in it. Among the pre-Socratics, few are as strange as Heraclitus of Ephesus, nicknamed the Obscure. He's a fascinating contrast to the usual image of philosophers chatting in the marketplace. Heraclitus openly despised most people, whom he saw as ignorant and asleep. His wisdom wasn't for the masses, but for a few able to grasp the cosmos's deep truth. Heraclitus wasn't just a misanthrope. His dislike of the crowd came from his philosophy. He believed most people lived in illusion, unaware of the logos, the universal principle of reason and order behind everything. For him, the logos was the unchanging law explaining constant change and the unity of opposites in the universe. Regular folks stuck in shallow views couldn't see this truth. His sayings like, "Most men are bad," or "donkeys would rather have straw than gold," show his deep skepticism about humanity's ability to find true wisdom. His isolation wasn't shyness, but a strong belief that truth was only found through deep reflection and understanding the logos, not through popular debate or majority opinion. Heraclitus's strangeness also showed in how he wrote dense, mysterious, often contradictory aphorisms. Unlike clear treatises, his fragments are like riddles needing serious thought. Famous phrases like, "You cannot step twice into the same river," or "The way up and the way down are one and the same," are known for their ambiguity and many possible meanings. This obscurity wasn't a flaw, but a choice. Heraclitus believed the logos itself was hard to grasp, and only those with sharp minds could uncover its truths. His style was a test, a way to separate shallow readers from true thinkers. To his contemporaries, this difficulty made him seem eccentric, a barrier between him and normal conversation, surrounding him with mystery and strangeness. Stories about Heraclitus reinforce his image as a loner. He reportedly lived in the mountains, eating herbs and roots, and turned down an invitation from King Darius to join his court, preferring solitude. It's said that when he got dropsy, he covered himself in cow dung, hoping the heat would help, an act many would see as filthy and crazy. But we need to be careful with these stories. Was Heraclitus really dirty because he was careless or ignorant? Probably not. His rejection of comforts and apparent filth, like his aphorisms, showed his deep indifference to social rules and appearances. For him, cleanliness and social etiquette were distractions from pursuing the logos. His misanthropy wasn't irrational hatred, but frustration at the blindness of most people. Heraclitus wasn't a provocateur like Diogenes in the marketplace. His strangeness was a deliberate withdrawal from the world, so he could focus on fundamental truths without social distractions. If his filth really existed as told, it was a philosophical choice, valuing purity of understanding over bodily cleanliness, truth over popular approval. His life showed that radical wisdom often demands solitude, and for many remains hard to understand. If there's a pre-Socratic who blends myth and spectacle, it's Empedocles of Acragas, modern Agrigento, Sicily. Unlike Heraclitus, he wasn't a hermit, but a flashy, complex figure who presented himself boldly, strange to many, almost divine to his followers. Empedocles didn't hold back on subtleties. In his poetic works about nature and purification, he didn't just explain the cosmos, he proclaimed himself an immortal god. He claimed to have the power to heal diseases, control the weather, and even raise the dead. "I am an immortal god, no longer mortal," he wrote, "honored by all, crowned with garlands." This was a bold claim in a culture that worshipped the gods, but didn't expect to see them openly walk among humans. What made him strange was this bold self-deification that set him apart not only from the sophists and traditional education, but even from other philosophers who sought truth through reason or austerity. For Empedocles, truth was a path to perfection, and the lifestyle he promoted, including strict vegetarianism, sexual abstinence, and rejecting violence, was how you could reach that divine status. His philosophy wasn't just a system of ideas, but a mystical path toward personal divinity. The most famous and dramatic story about Empedocles is how he died on Mount Etna. It's said that to prove his immortality, or maybe to ascend to the gods, he threw himself into the volcano's crater. The legend goes that Etna spat out one of his bronze sandals, proving he hadn't ascended but died, though this story is probably just a myth. This legend perfectly captures how people saw his uniqueness. A man who took his beliefs to the extreme, blurring the line between philosophical genius and divine megalomania. The story of Etna sums up his figure, a man who didn't just think about the divine but aimed to be divine in a way that was both grand and tragic. Empedocles' strangeness also came from his incredible versatility. He wasn't just a philosopher who proposed that the universe is made of 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and 2 cosmic forces, love and strife. He was also a respected doctor who was said to have resurrected a woman, a prolific poet who wrote his philosophy in epic verse, and an active politician fighting the oligarchy in his hometown. This mix made him a unique and charismatic figure, unlike other philosophers who specialized or withdrew. Empedocles threw himself fully into public life and knowledge. His strangeness wasn't about isolation, but an overflowing genius and eccentricity mixing science, mysticism, politics, and divine self-promotion. He didn't just think philosophy, he lived it with drama and total conviction, seeing himself as a bridge between humans and gods. His life was a constant performance of his grand vision of the world and his place in it. Among the pre-Socratics, Parmenides of Elea and his student Zeno stand out for a very different kind of strangeness. Their uniqueness wasn't in eccentric living or divine claims, but in their relentless logical rigor that led to conclusions so abstract and counterintuitive they challenged everyday human experience. Parmenides is the founder of Eleatic monism. In his poem On Nature, he argues that being is one, unchanging, eternal, indivisible, and motionless. For him, change, motion, plurality, and emptiness are just illusions of the senses. Only reason, the logos, can lead to truth, not what we perceive. His key point, non-being can't exist because what isn't cannot be thought or named. So if change meant something stops being something to become something else, it would mean non-being exists, which is illogical. This tight logic was both his tool and his limit. For Parmenides, if something logically follows from his premises, it's true no matter how absurd it seems in everyday life. This strict rationalism was a form of strangeness. Zeno of Elea, Parmenides' student, took this logic to its extreme through famous paradoxes. He wanted to prove his teacher's ideas by showing that belief in motion and plurality leads to contradictions. The best-known paradoxes involve motion, like Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles, the fastest runner, will never catch the tortoise if it has a head start, because every time Achilles reaches where the tortoise was, it's moved a bit further. That distance, however small, always remains. To move from point A to point B, you have to first cross half the distance, then half the remaining distance, and so on infinitely. Since there's always some distance left, motion can never truly start or finish. Another paradox, a flying arrow at any instant takes up space equal to itself. If it occupies space, it's at rest. Since time is made of instants, and at each instant the arrow is still, the arrow never really moves. These paradoxes aren't just mental puzzles, but logical proofs that challenge our trust in the senses, forcing us to accept a rational truth, a universe that's singular and unmoving. Their strangeness lies in asking us to deny what we see and experience daily. The oddness of Parmenides and Zeno lies in the radical abstraction of their ideas, so far removed from everyday experience that many found them incomprehensible or absurd. while other philosophers focused on the world's material origins. Human virtue, or life in the city-state, the Eleatics dove deep into pure logic and metaphysics. Imagine an average Greek watching the sunrise and people walking in the agora, then being told all that is an illusion, that change and motion don't exist. This was a completely foreign idea, defying intuition and common sense. Their rejection of the senses as a source of reliable knowledge and focus on pure reason put them on an intellectual level unreachable for most. They weren't dirty nor prophetic like Empedocles, nor hermits like Heraclitus. Their strangeness was the purity of their reason, building a worldview so consistent internally but so alien externally that they lived in a conceptual universe ruled by logic, no matter how far from everyday experience. When it comes to strangeness in the pre-Socratic world, Pythagoras of Samos and the community he founded in Croton, southern Italy, are a prime example. Their uniqueness wasn't about personal misanthropy or isolation, but creating a secretive communal lifestyle that fused philosophy, math, and mysticism in ways deeply foreign to the average Greek. The Pythagoreans weren't just intellectuals. They were a brotherhood with strict rules on asceticism and purification. They believed in the transmigration of souls, meaning the human soul could be reborn in animal bodies. This belief led to their famous and strange rule against eating meat. For them, eating meat was spiritual cannibalism, risking consuming a soul that had once been human. But their most puzzling and mysterious prohibition was against broad beans. The exact reasons have been lost to time and myth, but people speculate it was because their shape resembled sexual organs or the gates of Hades, or because they caused flatulence, which was seen as impure, or maybe the belief that they contained souls of the dead. Whatever the reason, this ban, along with others like not stirring the fire with iron or not looking into a mirror by lamplight, made Pythagorean life a web of rules that from the outside looked arbitrary and deeply strange. Their asceticism wasn't just discipline, it was a path to purify the soul and free it from the cycle of reincarnation. The Pythagorean school was a secret society. Members called mathematikoi, the learners, and akousmatikoi, the listeners, lived together, shared their belongings, and had a period of silence at the start. Knowledge was passed down orally under strict oaths of secrecy. Their symbols and teachings were closely guarded. This secrecy sparked both fascination and suspicion. In a society where public life was everything, a closed, mysterious group with unknown rituals was naturally strange and maybe even dangerous. Rumors swirled, from being a political sect to practicing dark rites. Their isolation and refusal to share wisdom openly set them far apart from other philosophers, who debated openly in the agora. The real strangeness and brilliance of the Pythagoreans came from their unique mix of math, mysticism, and a radical lifestyle. To them, numbers weren't just tools to count. They were the very essence of reality, the principles behind the universe's harmony. They found numerical relationships in music, the Pythagorean scale, and geometry, the Pythagorean theorem, and believed the whole universe was a numerical symphony. This worldview, where every part of existence boiled down to mathematical ratios, was deeply mystical. Studying numbers and geometry wasn't just intellectual. It was a way to purify the soul and get closer to the universe's divine harmony. So, asceticism, dietary rules, and secrecy weren't random whims, but essential parts of a religious philosophical system aiming for salvation through knowledge and discipline. Pythagorean life was total immersion. Every action, every meal, every study filled with cosmic and spiritual meaning. This complete dedication to such a specific way of living, so far from the social norms of the city-state, made them one of the most fascinating and, from an outsider's view, strangest groups in pre-Socratic philosophy. After the pre-Socratics who looked for the origins of the cosmos, a new kind of thinker turned his attention to people and the city. The classical philosophers, especially Socrates, marked a before and after, not just in philosophy, but in what it meant to be a philosopher. If you're watching this now, I hope you're already subscribed. I'm Nighttime Scribe, and I want to build a huge community of people who love the night and knowledge. Thousands from all over the world connected by a shared desire to learn more, know themselves better, and live better lives. I always say, knowing history is key to avoiding the mistakes of the past. So please take a moment to subscribe and share this video with a friend who loves learning. And if you feel inspired to support this humble servant with a super thanks, my gratitude for sharing this moment is endless. Now, let's get back to the story. If any figure captured the idea of philosophical strangeness for the average Athenian, it was Socrates. He didn't write a single word, but his impact was huge. His presence in Athens streets was unmistakable and often unsettling, both for how he looked and how he taught. Descriptions of Socrates by Plato and Xenophon don't paint him as tidy. He was known for walking barefoot, even in winter, and wearing the same tunic at home and in public, no matter the season. His looks were rough, a flat nose, bulging eyes, often compared to satyrs or Sileni, mythical creatures known for their ugliness and connection to Dionysus. He didn't care about hygiene or clothes. His disregard for appearances was clear. This wasn't because he lacked resources. He came from a respected artisan family, but because it was a bold statement. In a society where manners, dress, and public image were crucial to a citizen's reputation, Socrates openly challenged these norms. His detachment from material things showed his belief that real wealth and value were in the soul and knowledge, not possessions or status. For him, spending time on looks was a distraction from what mattered. What really made Socrates strange to others was his method, called the mutic, or the art of giving birth to ideas. It involved constant questioning. He would approach anyone, artisans, politicians, even generals, and ask simple questions that slowly exposed their ignorance and contradictions. Socrates saw himself as a gadfly to Athens, a pesky but necessary insect, stinging the noble but lazy horse of the city to wake it up. He didn't give answers, but wanted each person to find their own truth through self-examination. This constant public criticism, exposing even powerful people's ignorance, made him uncomfortable to many and a frustrating figure. He didn't want followers but thinkers. Another odd thing about Socrates was his claim to hear an inner divine voice. His daimonion wasn't a voice telling him what to do, but warning him what not to do. This inner guide, which sometimes led him to avoid politics or act unconventionally, made him even more of an outsider. While official religion centered on the Olympian gods and oracles, Socrates talked about a personal revelation, something that could sound sacrilegious or crazy. His indifference to social and material norms wasn't accidental. He never charged for teaching, despite being poor, didn't get involved in politics except when required by law, and didn't seek honors. For him, pursuing areté, virtue and self-knowledge, was the only task worth a human's time. An unexamined life is not worth living, was his motto. This total dedication to philosophy above everything else made him a stranger in his own city. Socrates' neglect of appearance and his overall strangeness can be seen as a deliberate philosophical act. His look and method were tools designed to provoke reflection and self-awareness. By presenting himself as a simple, unkempt man, he challenged the Athenian belief that wisdom or virtue was tied to wealth or status. Through constant questioning, he pushed his fellow citizens to face their own ignorance and to rethink accepted truths. His goal wasn't to provoke just for the sake of it, but to spark moral and intellectual awakening. For Socrates, true areté wasn't success or fame, but the excellence of the soul, achieved only through self-knowledge and the ongoing practice of virtue. His life was a living example of his philosophy, a sincere, uncompromising pursuit of truth, no matter the cost. Unfortunately, Socrates' strangeness and his role as Athens' gadfly were key reasons behind his trial and death sentence. He was charged with impiety for not believing in the city's gods and introducing new ones, and for corrupting the youth. While the charges were formal, the real reason was his social and political discomfort, his constant questioning of authority and established values, his indifference to money and politics, and his habit of exposing the powerful's ignorance made him unpopular and dangerous in an Athens recovering from military defeat and tyranny. His philosophical strangeness, his commitment to truth over social convenience, sealed his fate. Socrates chose death rather than give up his mission to examine life, becoming a martyr for philosophy and the ultimate example of a thinker who defies norms to pursue a higher truth. After Socrates' death, his most famous student Plato carried on his legacy, but in a very different way. Plato wasn't physically unkempt like his teacher, but his strangeness came from the abstraction of his metaphysical ideas and the radical nature of his political and social proposals. He founded the Academy, the first higher learning institution in the West, which became a new kind of separation from the world. Unlike Socrates or Diogenes, Plato came from a noble family, and his life wasn't marked by poverty or physical detachment. His strangeness was purely intellectual and metaphysical. His key idea was the theory of forms or ideas, which claims there's an intelligible, eternal, and unchanging world of perfect ideas, like beauty, justice, and the good, that represent true reality, while the physical world we experience is just an imperfect, changing copy. For the average Athenian, used to tangible, practical reality, the idea of a world of abstract, invisible ideas that can't be reached through normal experience was deeply strange and hard to grasp. How could something as concrete as a table be just a shadow of a perfect table idea existing somewhere else? Plato's strangeness lay in his ability to rise above everyday experience and explore a realm of abstractions only accessible through reason and debate. His approach wasn't messy, but too clean and perfect for the imperfect real world. To encourage studying these high ideas, Plato founded the Academy around 387 BC. It wasn't a public school open to all, but a research and teaching center where students and professors lived and worked together, focused on philosophy, math, astronomy, and more. This communal life dedicated to study was a new kind of separation from the world. Unlike Socrates, who mixed with people in the public square, the academics lived in a more secluded, selective environment. Though not hermits, their focus on contemplation and intellectual debate inside the Academy's walls distanced them from trivial matters and everyday politics. It was a withdrawal from the active city life to train minds that would ideally return to govern someday. This focus on long study and a more austere, reason-driven lifestyle was a form of otherness, elitist to a society that valued direct public involvement. Perhaps Plato's strangest and most radical idea appears in his most famous work, The Republic. There he lays out his vision of an ideal city-state ruled not by democracies, oligarchies, or tyrannies, which he saw as corrupted, but by philosopher kings. According to Plato, only those who dedicated their lives to philosophy and truly understood the ideas of the good and justice were fit to rule. He argued that by grasping true justice, these philosopher kings would govern selflessly for the common good, not for personal gain. This political ideal was deeply strange to the Greek mindset of the time, which prized civic participation and oratory in the agora. The idea that the best rulers would be ascetic thinkers without property or family, devoted solely to the state, clashed directly with most people's personal and political ambitions. In democratic Athens, where public speaking and influencing the assembly mattered most, the notion of a government led by philosophers who ignored popular opinion seemed utopian, authoritarian, or just plain unrealistic. So Plato's otherness wasn't in shocking physical or social behavior, but in the grand scope and idealism of his proposals, which soared so far beyond practical reality that many found them incomprehensible and thus strange. If Socrates was the gadfly and Plato the idealist, Aristotle stands as the great systematizer, a student of Plato with a very different worldview. Aristotle is probably the least strange of the three classic philosophers when it comes to personality. No stories of extreme eccentricity or detachment survive, but his strangeness lies in the sheer scale, depth, and encyclopedic nature of his thinking. He didn't go barefoot or live in a barrel. He dressed well, came from means, and had an active life, tutoring Alexander the Great and later founding the Lyceum, another major educational institution, but with a different style than Plato's academy. His otherness wasn't physical or social, but intellectual. What makes him strange is that one man laid the foundations for so many disciplines that lasted centuries. His genius was in organizing, classifying, and analyzing nearly every area of knowledge of his time. Logic, metaphysics, ethics, politics, poetics, rhetoric, physics, biology, zoology, meteorology, astronomy, psychology. His work was so vast and systematic, it's still astonishing. This unmatched intellectual ambition to create a unified system explaining everything, from the tiniest creature to the unmoved mover driving the cosmos, is his real strangeness. It's the strangeness of a mind that embraced everything, seeking reason and order in every corner of the observable universe. The key difference and source of strangeness, or perhaps common sense taken to the extreme in Aristotle, especially compared to Plato, was his strong empirical focus. While Plato looked to a transcendent world of ideas for truth, Aristotle looked to the world around him, to sensory experience. For Aristotle, knowledge came from observation, experimentation, and classification. He spent countless hours studying plants, dissected and categorized hundreds of marine species, weather phenomena, and political systems. His philosophy didn't start with abstract ideas to apply later. Instead, it rose from observing specifics to form general principles. This practical approach led him to criticize Plato's theory of forms, arguing that forms couldn't exist apart from real things. For Aristotle, the essence of a table wasn't some perfect table idea in another realm, but was found in the table itself, in its matter, its shape, its purpose, and its maker. This difference is crucial. Plato said, "What's real is the abstract, unchanging idea. The physical world is just an imperfect copy." Aristotle said, "What's real is the individual, concrete thing. Knowledge comes from observing that reality." His insistence on sticking to what's observable and tangible, breaking reality down to understand it, instead of chasing things beyond human experience, made him strange to some, especially the Platonists. He brought philosophy back down to earth with a method that laid the groundwork for the scientific method, a huge intellectual achievement still respected today. After Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, the Greek world underwent a massive shift. The golden age of the polis, the independent city-state that was the heart of civic and philosophical life, started to fade. Instead, vast Hellenistic empires ruled by Alexander's generals took over. This wasn't just a political or geographic change. It fundamentally shifted people's mindsets and goals, reshaping philosophy itself. The fall of the polis was a huge blow for many Greeks. Before, a person's identity was tied directly to their city. I'm Athenian, or I'm Spartan. Public life in the agora, voting in the assembly, defending the city in war, all of this defined areté, virtue. But with the rise of huge Hellenistic empires, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, the Antigonids in Macedonia, citizens became subjects of distant kings. Borders expanded, cultures blended, and individuals often felt lost and powerless facing these giant states. Decisions were no longer made in local assemblies but in far-off royal palaces. The average person's political influence dropped dramatically. This radical change caused deep feelings of alienation and uncertainty. If life's purpose was no longer found in active civic participation, where could a person find stability and meaning? This is where Hellenistic philosophy found its new focus. The big question shifted from what's the best polis to how can I live a good, happy life in a world I can't control? Philosophy turned to the pursuit of individual happiness, eudaimonia, and inner peace, ataraxia. It was no longer about building the perfect city, but about creating a strong inner fortress to withstand life's chaos. The major Hellenistic schools, Epicureanism, Stoicism, and skepticism, emerged as answers to this new challenge, offering ways to find mental calm and personal happiness, even in a confusing, often hostile world. Philosophers adapted their teachings to reach a broader audience focused more on personal well-being than civic ideals. Their talks and lifestyles reflected this shift, seeking practical wisdom and peace in a post-polis age. If the Hellenistic era looked for individual happiness, the Cynics gave the most shocking and vivid answer. They didn't just talk about living well, they lived it in the rawest, most radical way, turning dirtiness and otherness into a challenge to all social norms. The most famous and infamous Cynic was Diogenes of Sinope, nicknamed the Dog. His life was a non-stop philosophical act meant to shock society awake to its hypocrisy. Diogenes took Socratic detachment to the extreme, giving up all possessions and living in utter poverty. His most famous home was a large barrel, or jar, in the Matroon, the temple of the Mother of the Gods in Athens. He owned only a cloak, a staff, and a knapsack. It's said that when he saw a child drink water with his hands, he threw away his only bowl, realizing he didn't even need that. He wore the same ragged cloak without caring about cleanliness or manners, but most shocking was his total rejection of modesty. Diogenes believed natural bodily functions shouldn't be shameful and did them openly. This was the peak of his dirtiness and otherness. Stories about him include public masturbation and defecation, eating where it was forbidden, or carrying a lamp in broad daylight looking for an honest man. When Alexander the Great asked what he wanted, Diogenes said, "Stand out of my sunlight." To many, this was madness or extreme rudeness, but for Diogenes it was a deliberate philosophical tactic. Every act was a sharp critique of social conventions, civilization's hypocrisy, material obsession, and false values. His dirtiness wasn't poor hygiene, but a living proof that true freedom comes from total indifference to others' opinions and rules. It was a slap in the face to the clean, educated society he saw as morally corrupt. Diogenes' behavior was rooted in two key Cynic ideas. Autarkeia, self-sufficiency, meaning happiness and virtue, come from relying only on yourself, free from material needs, social rules, and others' judgments. And areté, shamelessness, the freedom to act without modesty or embarrassment, especially in public, to challenge artificial, oppressive norms. For the Cynics, shame was a social construct blocking true freedom and natural living. These principles formed the core of their strange lifestyle, turning what most found disgusting into radical philosophical virtue. Cynicism didn't start with Diogenes. Antisthenes, another student of Socrates, founded the Cynic school. He preached virtue through austerity, hard work, and rejection of pleasures and social norms, setting the stage for Diogenes' even more extreme lifestyle. He taught that virtue alone was enough for happiness, and nothing else was necessary. Other cynics, like Crates of Thebes, who gave up his huge fortune to follow the cynic path alongside his wife, Hipparchia, also lived lives of extreme simplicity and provocation. Their impact on society was twofold. On one hand, they caused scandal and disgust among most people. On the other, they attracted followers who saw in their radical lifestyle a genuine way to live, a refuge from the pressures and corruption of civilized life. Choosing such a dirty and unusual life wasn't a mental illness, but a bold, performative critique of social norms. The Cynics saw civilization as a source of vice, hypocrisy, and suffering. They believed that social rules, the chase for wealth, fame, and power, were chains keeping people from real freedom and happiness. By living in a way that directly challenged these norms, they aimed to expose how fake and empty those rules were. Their dirtiness was a protest against society's moral filth. Their otherness was like a warped mirror reflecting so-called normality as irrational and corrupt. Led by Diogenes, the Cynics were the punk rockers of ancient philosophy, using their own bodies and lives as a living manifesto against a world they saw as sick. While the Cynics responded to the unease of the Hellenistic age with shock and detachment, the Stoics offered a more socially acceptable, though equally radical solution. Founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 BC in Athens, his school, the Stoa Poikile, or Painted Porch, gave Stoicism its name, though its followers didn't live in barrels or act outrageously. Their otherness was in their radical indifference to passions and pain, aiming for unshakable inner peace. Zeno, who was Phoenician by birth, was shipwrecked in Athens and after reading about Socrates started his own school. Unlike Epicurus's garden or Plato's academy, Zeno taught in a public porch open to everyone, showing his belief that philosophy should be for everyday people, not just the elite. His first students were known for discipline and simplicity, but not for cynic eccentricities. Stoic otherness wasn't about looks or hygiene. It was an unyielding mental and emotional discipline. They aimed for apatheia, which doesn't mean apathy as we think of it today, but freedom from irrational passions like anger, fear, excessive desire, and uncontrolled pleasure. They believed these passions clouded judgment and led to misery. For the average person, it seemed strange to see someone striving to stay calm, no matter what fortune or hardship came their way. A Stoic sought neither wild joy in success nor despair in failure. For them, true happiness didn't depend on what happened, things outside our control, but on how we respond, which is within our control. This ability to stay calm and rational in any situation without being shaken by pain or insult was seen as almost superhuman, or at least a very demanding discipline. The core Stoic belief is that virtue is the only real good and vice the only real evil. Everything else, health, wealth, pleasure, pain, fame, poverty, is indifferent. That doesn't mean these things don't matter, but they're not inherently good or bad, so they shouldn't be chased or avoided as ends in themselves. Happiness, or eudaimonia, comes from living in harmony with nature and reason, which means living virtuously. This was a strange idea in a society that, like ours, valued wealth, pleasure, and success. Stoics were ready to give up anything that wasn't virtue. If life put them in extreme poverty or unbearable pain, they aimed to accept it calmly, without complaint, knowing their true worth, the virtue of their character, remained untouched by outside circumstances. It was a philosophy of resilience and mental strength taken to the extreme. While the Stoic school started in Greece, It reached its peak and greatest influence in Rome, with figures who put these strange ideas into practice in very different lives. Epictetus, a former slave who became a leading Stoic teacher, showed that inner freedom and virtue don't depend on social status. His discourses and manual are straightforward and practical, teaching how to tell the difference between what's under our control, our judgments, desires, and aversions, and what isn't. The body, wealth, reputation, or death. His strangeness was that despite being a slave, he considered himself the freest man alive, the true master of his own mind. Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor and one of the most powerful men of his time, devoted his life to practicing Stoicism. His meditations, written for himself, reveal a soul struggling to keep calm and virtuous amid the pressures of power, war, and personal loss. His strangeness was a man with all the power in the world, yet seeking humility, discipline, and detachment from earthly glory. The Stoics' focus on internal control and indifference to external things offered a strong philosophy for dealing with an uncertain world. Their strangeness wasn't physical, but a mental discipline so strict it changed how people saw reality and what it means to live well, even if that meant appearing emotionless or detached from basic human feelings. In contrast to the Cynics' provocation and the Stoics' rigor, the Epicureans offered a third path to happiness in the Hellenistic world. Their founder, Epicurus, started his school in Athens around 306 BC in a place called the Garden. Though less physically strange than the Cynics, the Epicureans' oddness was in their radical and often misunderstood idea of happiness, based on pleasure and their avoidance of public life. Epicurus and his followers lived in a semi-private community in the garden, a refuge from the noise and worries of the polis. This garden was unusual because it welcomed everyone, men, women, slaves, and foreigners, which was rare for philosophical schools at the time. In this calm, secluded place, life was simple and focused on philosophical talks, friendship, and study. Their withdrawal from public life was itself a kind of strangeness. While most Athenians aimed to be active in civic and social life, the Epicureans chose a quieter life focused on the personal, which many saw as turning their backs on civic duty. The biggest oddity and source of misunderstanding about the Epicureans was their idea of pleasure. They're often called wild hedonists, but their teaching was quite the opposite. For Epicurus, pleasure wasn't about chasing excess or sensual thrills. It was the absence of physical pain, aponia, and mental disturbance, ataraxia. For the Epicureans, true pleasure was the calm of the soul and meeting basic needs. This meant avoiding endless desires like political ambition, chasing wealth, or indulging in luxury that only led to frustration and pain. They valued the joy of talking with friends, enjoying a simple meal, and having a peaceful mind free from fears, especially fear of the gods and death, which Epicurus focused on in much of his philosophy. To outsiders, the idea that happiness came from limiting desires and finding contentment in moderation might seem strange in a society driven by the pursuit of glory, power, and wealth. The Epicurean vision of a peaceful life without extremes and free from worry was unusual and often mistaken for laziness or secret indulgence. Their oddness was that of a philosophy seeking joy through denying conventional pleasures and lowering expectations. Another distinctive feature of the Epicureans was their famous motto, "Vive occulto," live in hiding. This meant the wise person should avoid getting involved in politics and public life as much as possible. They believed politics was a never-ending source of suffering, ambition, rivalry, and disruption that kept people from achieving tranquility. They preferred to focus on friendship and peace within their private community. In a Hellenistic world where, even though the city-state had lost power, civic participation was still idealized, the Epicureans' disinterest in politics was often seen as alienation or escapism. For many, it was hard to understand why anyone would choose not to influence their community or seek public fame. This stance brought criticism and misunderstanding, but for the Epicureans, it was the only way to protect inner peace in a chaotic world. Their garden and their pursuit of moderate pleasure, based on the absence of pain and disturbance, offered a way out of suffering. Their strangeness was that of a philosophy redefining happiness as serenity and self-sufficiency, choosing seclusion and moderation as the safest route to a full life free from the chaos of the world. Faced with the certainties offered by other Hellenistic schools, the skeptics presented an equally radical but totally opposite response. Systematic doubt. Founded by Pyrrho of Elis around 360 BC, this school proposed that true peace of mind comes not from finding truth, but from accepting that certain knowledge is impossible. Pyrrho, the first radical skeptic, is surrounded by stories highlighting his extreme calmness. They say he was so unshakable that he stayed calm even in physical danger or pain. One famous story tells how, during a storm at sea, his fellow passengers panicked. Pyrrho, however, just pointed at a pig calmly eating despite the waves, showing that mental peace is possible even in trouble if you stay indifferent. This indifference wasn't apathy or ignorance, but a result of his radical skepticism. If we can't be sure what things really are, why get upset about them? His oddness was in his extreme passivity toward appearances and outside events, a refusal to react emotionally to what can't be known for certain. In a world where people respond with fear, joy, or anger, Pyrrho's calmness was unusual, even almost inhuman. The skeptic's main goal was epoché, the suspension of judgment. They argued that for every claim there are always equally strong arguments for and against. Since the senses can deceive us and human reason is limited, we can't reach absolute certainty about reality or what actions are truly right or wrong. So the way to avoid mental disturbance, like Epicurus's ataraxia but by different means, is to withhold firm judgments. If we don't assert anything as certain, we can't be proven wrong and won't suffer the frustration of error or the anxiety of not knowing. This total suspension of belief, and therefore action based on firm beliefs, was key to peace of mind. For them, mental conflicts come from pretending to possess the truth. While Plato sought truth in ideas, Aristotle in observation, the Stoics in reason and virtue, and the Epicureans in controlled pleasure, the skeptics claimed none of these paths could give absolute certainty. This view went against the claimed wisdom of nearly all earlier thinkers. If we can't really know anything for sure, why bother philosophizing? The skeptical answer was paradoxical. We philosophize to realize we can't know, and through that realization, we find peace. Living without firm beliefs, without claiming to have the truth and accepting that absolute knowledge is impossible, turned skepticism into a life of constant questioning and intellectual detachment. Their oddness wasn't in shocking behavior, but in a mindset that refused to cling to any truth, even its own. They were often accused of inconsistency for saying nothing can be known. They were the intellectual provocateurs, forcing others to justify their certainties and reminding everyone how fragile claims to absolute knowledge are, while offering mental freedom through doubt. We've traveled a fascinating path, from the pre-Socratics who sought the areté to the Hellenistic thinkers chasing ataraxia. What's clear is that the filth and strangeness of many Greek philosophers weren't accidents but intentional parts of their philosophy, tools, not goals. Their dirtiness and odd behavior weren't ends in themselves, but means to catharsis, provocation, truth-seeking, or principle demonstration. The common image of the Greek philosopher as a careless eccentric is somewhat true on the surface, but as we've seen, their behavior went far beyond just bad hygiene or quirky personalities. For these thinkers, their look and actions were powerful philosophical tools, ways to provoke and critique society. Figures like Diogenes the Cynic used extreme poverty, shamelessness, and shocking acts to expose the hypocrisy, shallowness, and vanity of Greek society. Their filth was a mirror reflecting the moral filth of social conventions. It wasn't meant to be repulsive for its own sake, but to force their peers to face their own values and biases. It was a visible, tangible slap, a living proof of their philosophical ideas. For the Cynics, living without possessions and shame was the real proof of self-sufficiency, autonomy, and true freedom. For Socrates, his indifference to clothes or material wealth showed his belief that true virtue and care of the soul were the only things worth pursuing. Actions spoke louder than any written work. The radical search for truth and purification was central. Philosophers like the Pythagoreans embraced asceticism and dietary rules, not just as whims but as part of a mystical, mathematical path toward purifying the soul and understanding cosmic harmony. Discipline of the body was a way to raise the spirit and intellect. Even Heraclitus, with his solitude and seeming indifference to suffering, sought a pure connection with the Logos, far from the distractions of human life, expressing inner freedom. The Stoics, more conventional on the outside, pursued a kind of internal strangeness, radical indifference to pain, pleasure, and external events. Their dirtiness was mental, the cleansing of the mind from irrational passions to reach unbreakable peace. It wasn't for show, but a strict discipline. Ultimately, the dirtiness and strangeness of these philosophers shouldn't be seen as mere quirks or random stories. They were real expressions of deep philosophical commitment. For them, philosophy wasn't just a set of ideas or intellectual exercise. It was a way of life, a way of being in the world that often meant challenging, provoking, and living on the edges of what was normal, all to glimpse a deeper truth and a more genuine path to happiness and wisdom. Their legacy pushes us to look past appearances and question what it really means to live a good life. The relationship between these strange philosophers and Greek society was a constant, complex tension, a tug-of-war between being marginalized and being admired. It wasn't just black and white, accepted or rejected, but a spectrum where their very strangeness could provoke both disgust and deep respect, often at the same time. At the heart of this tension was the purpose of radical philosophy. The polis valued social harmony, respect for tradition, civic participation, and virtue within accepted limits. The radical philosopher, by definition, questioned, undermined, or ignored those norms in pursuit of a truth or way of life beyond convention. This naturally caused conflict. Socrates is the perfect example of this tension. He was an Athenian citizen who fought in war, but his method of non-stop questioning and disregard for appearances made him a bothersome gadfly. Young intellectuals like Plato and Xenophon admired him as the embodiment of wisdom and virtue. But for most Athenians, especially the powerful who felt threatened by his questions, he was a dangerous troublemaker. His trial and execution clearly show how his strangeness and challenge to social norms led to his ultimate rejection. While Socrates earned admiration from his followers, the Cynics, led by Diogenes, pushed this tension to the extreme. Their intentional filth and public provocations made most people disgusted and disdainful. They were seen as vagabonds, shameless, and to many, crazy. Yet at the same time, they attracted followers who saw in their radicalism a genuine authenticity and freedom. People didn't just come to mock Diogenes, they came to hear his sharp critiques and his vision of a life free from restrictions. Their marginalization was partly self-imposed and part of their message, but it also sparked fascination that went beyond rejection. They were outcasts who, paradoxically, became cult figures. The Pythagoreans, with their secrecy and odd rules like banning beans, were met with a mix of respect for their mathematical genius and suspicion because of their secretive ways. Their community was admired for discipline and discovery, but also feared and sometimes persecuted for being exclusive and politically influential. Their strangeness made them both respected and feared. Even philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, who weren't personally dirty, caused tension with society. Plato's abstract ideas and his idea of philosopher kings were seen by many as utopian or elitist, disconnected from Athenian politics. His academy, though respected, was an intellectual retreat away from public life. Aristotle, more practical, was still a foreigner in Athens, and his vast knowledge, though admired, placed him on a level not everyone could reach. In the end, the strange philosopher's relationship with society reflected society itself. Their strangeness acted like a mirror, sometimes warped, that forced the polis to face its contradictions, hypocrisies, and limits. When society rejected a Diogenes for being filthy, it was really rejecting the critique of its obsession with appearances and wealth. When Athens condemned Socrates, it was not just for the charges, but because his strangeness and relentless truth-seeking shook up the established order and exposed the ignorance of those who thought they were wise. So the strange philosophers weren't just outsiders, they were social catalysts. Their lives and ideas, no matter how uncomfortable, forced society to reflect on its values. They were admired by those seeking deeper truth and authenticity, and rejected by those threatened by their challenge to norms. Their strangeness was their real power. The eccentricity of these Greek philosophers, far from a mere historical oddity, left a lasting legacy that shaped Western thought in fundamental ways. Their commitment to living their ideas, no matter how strange or dirty it looked, laid the groundwork for the dissident intellectual, the one who, out of conviction and search for truth, dares to challenge norms and live on society's edges. Their main legacy is seeing philosophy not just as academic study or theory, but as a radical way of life. For Socrates, Diogenes, or Epictetus, living consistently with one's beliefs was essential. Their strangeness was proof of that consistency. This idea deeply influenced Hellenism and beyond. The Hellenistic schools, the Stoics, Epicureans, and Cynics, inherited this notion directly. Their philosophies became therapies for the soul, with practices and principles aimed at tranquility and happiness, leading to profound lifestyle changes. The Stoics exercised reason, the Epicureans controlled desires, and the Cynics renounced everything, but all sought to live true to their convictions, even if very differently. Asceticism, detachment from material things, and the pursuit of a virtuous life, traits seen in the earliest Christian monks and saints, have distant echoes in some Greek philosophical schools, especially the Pythagoreans and Cynics. The idea that purifying the soul requires renouncing the material world wasn't foreign to Greek philosophy. The eccentric behavior of many of these thinkers was actually a radical social and political critique. Their refusal to play by the rules of appearances or power structures paved the way for the philosopher's role as society's conscience. The figure of the gadfly, Socrates, by questioning his fellow citizens and exposing their ignorance, set the precedent for the intellectual who, even at great personal risk, refuses to stay silent about uncomfortable truths. His trial and execution became an eternal symbol of free thought persecuted by those in power, the denunciation of hypocrisy. The Cynics, with their shamelessness, showed that public provocation could be a powerful tool to expose the contradictions and emptiness of social norms. They inspired future movements that used direct action and challenges to conventions to achieve their goals. In the post-polis era, Hellenistic philosophers, many living lifestyles strange to the norm, emphasized individual freedom and the pursuit of personal happiness. This shift was crucial. Inner freedom, demonstrated by Stoics and Epicureans, though in different ways, showed that happiness doesn't depend on external factors like wealth, status, or health, but on how we control our perceptions and desires. This idea has echoed through history, from Roman philosophy to modern thinkers who stress strength of character and personal resilience. The dissident intellectual, the philosopher who chooses his own path and lives by self-imposed principles no matter how unpopular, was shaped by these Greeks, influencing medieval thinkers, Enlightenment figures, and counter-cultural movements. The idea that true wisdom can be found off the beaten path, sometimes requiring a life that seems strange or dirty to the world, is a direct legacy of their boldness. In conclusion, the eccentricity of the Greek philosophers wasn't just a colorful detour in the history of thought, but a vital expression of philosophy as a living, transformative force. They showed us that the pursuit of truth and virtue sometimes demands breaking with the status quo, accepting others' misunderstanding, and even embracing the apparent dirtiness or strangeness of a lifestyle that, at its core, is the purest form of intellectual freedom. Their legacy still calls on us to live authentically and question appearances. We've traveled through time to explore the strangeness of the Greek philosophers, but the big question remains: does the figure of the strange philosopher still exist today? What does it mean to be radical in thought or life in an age dominated by connectivity, social media, and image culture? While you probably won't find modern thinkers living in barrels or masturbating in public, the spirit of philosophical strangeness lives on, though in new forms. Radicalism today isn't just about physical renunciation, but about challenging the norms of thought and behavior in contemporary society. Today's cynics might be those who reject rampant consumerism, adopt minimalist or off-grid lifestyles, or use digital platforms to expose social hypocrisy through satire or provocation. They might not be dirty, but their indifference to appearances or social expectations can seem strange in a world obsessed with image. Think of activists who live on the streets to highlight poverty, or performance artists who use their bodies to call out injustice. Modern Socratics include public figures or intellectuals who, like Socrates, dedicate themselves to relentless questioning, challenging the status quo, accepted truths, and dominant narratives. They might be investigative journalists, critical academics, or thinkers who expose ignorance or contradictions in political, economic, or social systems, even if it risks getting canceled or marginalized. Their strangeness lies in their refusal to stay silent or accept things at face value. The Stoics today might be those who cultivate unshakable calm amid chaos, practicing digital detox, choosing emotional sobriety, or resisting the overstimulation and anxiety of modern life. To a society that glorifies unchecked emotional outbursts and constant excitement, their discipline may seem strange, a quiet resistance to the frenzy. Epicureans of well-being today are those who prioritize mental health and personal wellness over relentless ambition, material success, or constant political engagement. They seek happiness in small communities or simple pleasures. In a culture that prizes hyper-productivity, their pursuit of peace might look like passivity or escapism. To be radical in thought or life today means, as it did for the Greeks, challenging dominant conventions and dogmas, but in ways that fit our world. That might mean questioning connectivity and digital culture, consciously disconnecting, rejecting constant exposure, or critiquing technology's impact on our minds and society. It's the strangeness of choosing invisibility in a world that demands exhibition, challenging consumerism and materialism, going beyond headlines and media narratives, seeking alternative sources, practicing constructive skepticism like Pyrrho, but applied to today's misinformation, and daring to voice unpopular, well-reasoned opinions. All this is part of modern radicalism. Redefining success and happiness, away from wealth and fame toward community, sustainability, mental health, or personal fulfillment through non-material goals is another form of strangeness. Just like Socrates faced condemnation, being radical today can mean acting with unshakable integrity despite economic, political, or social pressure, even at personal or professional cost. The strangeness of the Greek philosophers reminds us that philosophy, at its core, is a living, disruptive practice. It calls us not only to think differently, but to live differently, and to accept that this difference might seem strange, even dirty, to mainstream society. In the end, radicalism isn't a goal itself, but a path to a more authentic life and deeper truth. Yesterday as today, we've come to the end of our journey through the fascinating and often misunderstood lives of the Greek philosophers. What's clear is this: the dirtiness and strangeness of these thinkers weren't meaningless quirks, extravagant whims, or mere hygiene lapses. Far from it, they were deeply coherent expressions of their complex philosophies, lived out within their specific social and cultural contexts. For the pre-Socratics, that strangeness was the boldness of reason breaking away from myth. For Socrates, it was the purity of the soul exposing social hypocrisy. For the Cynics, every shocking act was a clear slap at conventions, a living critique of slavery to possessions and others' opinions. For the Stoics and Epicureans, radicalism lay in the mental discipline of seeking inner peace in a chaotic world, no matter what appearances or external expectations said. These philosophers took their ideas to the extreme, turning their own lives into living proof of their principles. They didn't just write books, they shaped their bodies, habits, and relationships to reflect the truths they'd found. Their strangeness was, at its core, radical authenticity. So next time you hear the story of Diogenes in his barrel, or Socrates going barefoot, look beyond the surface. Ask yourself what they were really trying to say through their way of life. What uncomfortable truths were they revealing? Because behind their seeming disorder, these philosophers discovered a deeper order and left us a lasting legacy. True philosophy is a search for wisdom that demands consistency, courage, and sometimes the willingness to be radically strange to change the world. I hope you enjoyed this story and that it helped you unwind while you learned a bit of history. This is Nighttime Scribe, your loyal companion for those sleepless nights. If you liked the story, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to join this nocturnal, cultured community. Thanks for listening. Until the next adventure.